I'd like to say, first of all, thanks everyone for this great turnout. We actually have two audiences for this event today. One is our cluster group of the classes of 1975, 76, and 77. This is the 9th of 10 virtual events we'll have done beginning the first week of October. Our last event was a coffee house live event hosted by Bob Barker, who's with us today, and organized by Wendy Sanger. And next weekend will be our final event, which will be a Whitman women's soccer reunion. So welcome to our classmates, but also welcome to members of the larger Whitman community that are joining us today. We really appreciate you being here today. This is an important issue that I think all of us have noticed in the time since we graduated, and especially those that have graduated before us. And in a certain extent, this is a reunion of our past with your present. So I really extend thanks of our three classes to those of you who are joining us at this event today. So we have three distinguished classmates who will be discussing the issue of the decline of local news and its effects. I'll go through them quickly. Paul Hemp graduated from Whitman in 1975 with a degree in English. He has experience with local newspapers in both Washington and New Hampshire, and went on to an extremely distinguished career with the Wall Street Journal Europe, the Boston Globe, and the Harvard Business Review. He's just completed an assignment as the editor of an India-based tech publication. And Paul, you're on the East Coast, are you not?
Right, I live in Rhode Island.
Yeah. Ted Duncan is also joining us from the East Coast, I believe Pennsylvania. Ted was also an English major at Whitman and has worked for local papers in Alabama and New Mexico, in addition to the Associated Press. He currently works with Vanguard as both a writer and a project manager, and volunteers with a nonprofit in the Philadelphia area called Healthy News Work that was founded by his wife. It worked with elementary and middle school pupils on health-focused news writing. Our final panelist today is Roland Thompson, a fellow history graduate of Whitman. He's currently executive director of Allied Newspapers of Washington, which is a trade association working towards preserving First Amendment, as well as open courts and government. He has an extensive background in Washington state elective politics and has served as a staffer in both houses of the Washington legislature, in addition to numerous state boards, councils, and commissions. In addition to the discussion by our panelists today, we will also be having two polls for you to participate in during the event. Our format today will be divided into 4 sections of about 15 to 20 minutes each. The first 3 sections will address changes that our panelists have seen from the time we graduated to today in the local news. The second section will take account of the current situation with local newspapers, and the third, the political implications that this has for our environment in the United States. I do want to say that we'll be specifically working on the situation of local newspapers, not the national cable news networks, not the national newspapers such as the Wall Street Journal or the USA Today, nor the major urban dailies such as the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, or even the Seattle Times. What we'll be looking at are the situation of newspapers such as the Walla Walla Union Bulletin, the Daily and Olympian, the Everett Herald, the Port Townsend News Leader, which I think is now the Port Townsend Leader, and the Bremerton Sun. So to get us started off on this first topic, where we've been and where we have come from since graduation, Paul, you've had experience on both coasts in local newspapers. Would you like to start us off?
Sure. David, thanks so much actually to you and Nancy for organizing this conversation, but all the others that have been through as part of this kind of virtual reunions. And also thank you for everybody for showing up. Shoot, I thought maybe there'd be 3 or 4 people. Kind of you outnumber the panelists, so that's fun. I hope we'll have a conversation, a bit of a back and forth during Q&A. Certainly, this is a timely topic. It's in the news even now as part of the reconciliation bill that's currently being hashed out by Congress. So I think it's a timely topic that we'll hope will shed some light on collectively and individually. Let me begin with a personal story. In November 1977, I got on an Amtrak train in my hometown of Edmonds, Washington, bound for White River Junction, Vermont, filled with excitement about my first daily newspaper job with the Claremont, New Hampshire Eagle Times, the so-called voice of the Twin State Valley. As a parenthetical note, I later learned that on my trip across the country, as I was crossing North Dakota, the position I had been hired for was unexpectedly cut from the budget. But fortunately, when I was somewhere in Pennsylvania, the #2 reporter in the Springfield, Vermont bureau of the Eagle Times quit, opening up a job for me when I arrived. So when I got off the train in White River Junction at 4:30 or 5 in the morning, it seemed like the middle of the night, waited for a Vermont transit bus to take me to Claremont, changed into a sport coat and tie, and went to meet the guy who'd hired me over the phone, the editor, Royal Ford. And with a name like Royal Ford, I was imagining some crusty old New England editor with silver hair, chomping a cigar, maybe with a visor and arm garters. But this was the 70s after all. And when Royal came out to meet me after putting the afternoon paper to bed, he was wearing jeans, a plaid lumberjack shirt, and had hair down to his shoulders. So it wasn't quite what I expected in a traditional sense. But despite Royal's informal dress, it turned out that the Eagle Times was a small daily paper. Its circulation was only 11,000, but with big ambitions. Most small dailies were afternoon papers that came out 6 days a week with a morning edition on Saturday, but the Eagle Times came out Monday through Friday, and then had a Sunday paper with its actually own Sunday magazine section, which was kind of amazing for a small paper. We had a news staff of, I think, maybe 11 people, including a sports editor and reporter, plus an overall news editor, a Sunday editor, as well as the aforementioned Royal Ford. And during the time I was at the Eagle Times, we actually got a staff photographer. So reporters didn't always have to take their own pictures to go with the stories. It was a lively publication with, granted, with international and national and state news provided by UPI, but real enterprising coverage by staff reporters of local government and issues in our circulation area. And it was a good training ground for young journalists. Some of the people I worked with went on to work at good medium-sized dailies like the Concord Monitor and the Berkshire Eagle, and then went on to places like the Boston Globe, USA Today. There was even a fellow who ended up as a producer at National Public Radio. In 2009, though, the Eagle Times, voice of the Twin State Valley, went bankrupt. And I think the story is emblematic of the decline of local daily newspapers, which traditionally were the main source of news about local government, local schools, and other issues. Ted and Roland are going to talk in a minute about some specific reasons we should be concerned about the decline in local news. And Barry, you mentioned a couple others, your very specific examples before we began talking here. But let me just take a minute or two to talk about where we are and how we got here, and reel off some reasons for the decline that I think most of us are familiar with, but just to get them out on the table. First, a few statistics about where local news is today. In the mid-70s, when we were graduating our classes from college, there were 1,750 daily newspapers, most of them local dailies, which are the traditional source of local government civic news for most people, as opposed to weekly papers or even local radio or TV stations, which have often based their news reporting coverage on the reporting of local dailies. Since that high of 1,750 daily newspapers, nearly 500 of them have closed their doors in the time since then, with nothing really to replace them as a source of local news in many cases. And even when a local daily remains, shrinking budgets mean that there are fewer journalists to cover the news. The University of North Carolina's journalism program did research recently and says that half of local journalism jobs have evaporated in the past 15 years. and that leaves 1,800 communities without a reliable source of information on local issues um, and things that affect people's daily lives. So what's happened? Let's just take a quick run through the three overlapping categories of reasons for this decline. One category is economic, which will come as a surprise to no one, but let me just refresh our memory on it. Recent decades have seen really a collapse of local newspapers. Three traditional sources of revenue: classified advertising, help wanted ads, ads for rental housing, items for sale. Really the lifeblood of newspapers for years have migrated to online platforms such as Craigslist and Monster.com. Display advertising fell off a cliff because of the decimation of Main Street retail stores, which have been driven out of business not only by Amazon, but by big box stores like Walmart. Subscription revenue has plummeted, with many readers moving online for their news and what you might call quasi-news found in Facebook and other social media groups, often with the expectation, people's expectation that information like this won't cost them anything. You don't have to buy a subscription to get it. It's there online. So those are some of the economic reasons for the decline. Technological reasons, besides the internet siphoning off traditional sources of revenue, the internet gave us a 24-hour news cycle with news constantly updated in real time instead of once a day, making it difficult for even daily newspapers to keep up. Now, actually, most local dailies do have a website, but really haven't figured out a business model, a mix of advertising and subscriptions that turns a profit. And as I said before, or suggested, much of the news that's disseminated online is actually poached from traditional newspapers that people get for free. So there's technological reasons for the decline. The last one is cultural, I think. Interesting, in a time of widespread distrust of traditional media, that doesn't seem to apply to local daily newspapers. A study by the Poynter Institute that I just saw yesterday said small dailies are seen as the most significant and trustworthy sources of information in their communities. Not something that people you typically associate with traditional media sources. But the general view that newspapers, and this is really my own kind of thought, are an outmoded 20th century medium, means they are no longer really seen as indispensable pillars of local communities. Also, a lot of glamour surrounding newspapers, Woodward and Bernstein as rock stars that attracted some of us into the profession, despite the traditionally low salaries of working at newspapers. That sort of sex appeal or glamour is gone, I think, in most places. These days, a journalism school graduate is more likely to go into a relatively well-paid public relations job, becoming what newspaper people derisively call flacks, than to a newspaper reporting job. So that's kind of a lineup of some of the things that have led to this decline. It's not all bad news. Where newsrooms still do exist, there are more women in the newsroom and in management positions than there were in 1975, although minorities are still badly underrepresented in most newsrooms. And overall, it's not a pretty picture. I guess first off, what I want to do is before we take this as a given, I asked Ted and Roland, are we exaggerating the situation here? Is the decline of local newspapers really the crisis we're making it out to be, or is it, are we crying wolf when there's actually alternatives, or it's a natural evolution? So that's what I'd ask you two guys as a starting point, and I'll weigh in with my thoughts too are we making much ado about nothing? It's obviously not nothing, but are we making much ado about something that isn't that important?
I guess I'll go first. No, I don't think we're making too much about what's going on. It's not a good situation, but I agree there are also a few bright spots here and there. The one thing that's really struck me over the years is that even though the way people get their news has changed dramatically over the past 20 years or so, the hunger for news is still very strong. And people do try to get their news. And I have this abiding belief that over time, people will figure it out. It may not be newspapers. It may not be anything that is being done today in terms of the way the news media generate content and organize the content and distribute it. But I do think that it's important for people to understand what's going on in their community, in their state, and in the world.
And not only important, you're saying there's a natural human hunger to know those things, that you know, videos of cute cats isn't going to completely distract us from things that are really affect our lives. And that's interesting. That's a really interesting point, Ted. I think there may be a way out of this that we don't quite anticipate or know yet. Roland, what do you think? You see this, Roland didn't, I don't know if it was mentioned in Roland's bio, but he comes out of a newspaper family that owned small weeklies in Washington State. So saw this from, Roland was telling us about putting together, I forget what it was, what you were doing at age 8 with when you were for some local, one of your family's papers.
Sure. I grew up in the business. My folks owned weekly newspapers, as the Lodines and Dana Caldart know. Paul was a fraternity brother of mine, and so was Dana. And my father was in the state legislature as well. So politics and newspapering were talked about quite a bit. I also agree with Don Perry, who just sent a message out that we need to talk about broadcast, and I'll try to do that near the end, but I wanted to let him know that I also work for the broadcasters. I've spent most of my career since working for the legislature in advocating on behalf. I'm not really a journalist. I advocate on behalf of journalists, and I advocate on behalf of journalists for the things that you expect from journalists, which are to fight with the government over access to records for budgets and for access to meetings and all the rest of that. But I also try to make sure that the tax footprint for news organizations is fairly small and there aren't intrusions on the running of those businesses. One of the things that you really need to keep in the forefront of your mind as far as all of this goes, and Paul alluded to that, is what we're really talking about here is not newspapers. We're talking about news organizations, and news organizations that are able, under some sort of a business model, separate and apart from government, to put reporters into public meetings held by governmental agencies, by municipal governments across the country, and state capitals and all the rest of it. There are north of 85,000 local governments in the country. It depends on how you do your figuring, but it's probably closer to 90. And most of those meetings at the height of local news organizations were attended by a reporter who would be there to try to synthesize what was happening. Those meetings, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are now available by going to YouTube. You can see them in retrospect, or some other means of local community television access channels, or the rest of it. But you have to sit and work your way through those hours and hours and hours of mind-numbing budget discussions and all the rest of it. And you can't rely on a reporter who's very familiar with that subject to pick out the highlights and give you what you really need to know in 10 to 20 to 30 column inches, and give you a synopsis of what you need to know about what it's going to cost you and what the problems are for that local governmental entity. One of the other problems that's really acute in every state now are the state capitol bureaus. And I'll use Washington as an example because I'm very familiar with it, but Washington State, during legislative sessions in the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, and then on, had correspondents that would show up for the session, but they also had correspondents who were here year-round, and from news organizations that have gone away, like UPI, Reuters, and the rest that no longer exist. And the press houses here year-round would have roughly 20 to 24 people in them, and they would ramp up into the high 40s for the session when people would show up. We're down now to the point where they actually closed the press houses. They're going to tear them down to make to build a building for that, and they're moving the remaining year-round reporters into the Capitol building, and there'll probably be 6 to 8 of them that are there for the duration of the year. That's a big change. There used to be 6 or 8 television stations that had little studios and offices in the Capitol building in Olympia, in the legislative building. The kind of coverage and the eye that's being shown to state government has changed pretty significantly. In the time that there's been a decline in the news organizations that covered it, you've seen the rise of TVW, which is the online station that's carried by the cable networks all over the state. And you can watch virtually anything you want to watch that's put on by the state that TVW is able to get to, including the governor's press conferences. The governor's press conferences used to have 35, 36, 40, 48 people standing around and sitting in the cabinet room that the governor has, and now they're carried virtually, and any reporter in the state, if they're admitted, can ask questions for it. But the press conference goes on, and it kind of veers around, and they really aren't experienced people that can hold the governor's feet to the fire on many questions the way that used to function. And so you've got a lot of access now and a lot of video you can watch, but it's hours and hours of stuff. And as Paul refers to it, it's a fire hose of information that you couldn't possibly parse through without some sort of intermediary that was following it and could take it apart for you and talk about what's critical in this budget and what the weaknesses of that organization were, of that argument, and do some analysis and get some countervailing viewpoints. Those same sorts of things are done by the 4 caucuses in the legislature, and the same thing happens. They do weekly press availabilities during the session and monthly press availabilities during the rest of the year. And those same sorts of weaknesses exist within that system. So,
Roland, are you able to see, because you've been watching that up close and personal for, kind of over the period we're talking about here, do you see the negative consequences of stuff not getting synthesized by knowledgeable reporters? Or, I mean, as it filters back to people around the state?
So I'll give you 2 examples. One just happened today. And if you live in Washington state, you probably heard that for the first time in the history of the state since 1990, that the redistricting commission stubbed its toe and didn't get its work done. And they didn't meet the 11:59 deadline to get done. Jim Bruner from the Seattle Times did a lot of reporting about that, as did, oh my gosh, from Crosscut, Melissa Santos, an online publication. They both were on top of that, as were other folks, and they brought it to light. The redistricting commission was going to try to gloss it over and act like they had accomplished what they were supposed to accomplish, but actually their work's pretty much in disarray. That would not have happened had they not been on top of it. But there are numerous other instances where bad things happen and it takes a long time to figure out what's happened. The state of Washington lost somewhere between $400 billion and $650 billion in fraudulent unemployment claims over the last cycle while we were in the midst of this COVID. And it was due to a great deal of mismanagement at that agency. The director there is gone now. She went to the work for the Biden administration, and when they figured out the downsides of all of that, she's gone from there too, to spend more time with her family, that old euphemism. But those kinds of things wouldn't necessarily have happened if there were more reporters. The first one, or the second anyway, the employment security issue, if there were reporters asking a lot of questions about how all of those systems and if the checks and balances were in place to make sure that fraud wasn't being perpetrated. But it happens
Roland,
in city councils.
No, go ahead.
It happens in city councils and all the rest. The outgoing mayor of Seattle is in some trouble over the fact that she's deleted numerous text messages and things that were being sent around during the uprisings in Seattle over the summer of 2020 and 2021. And it's a lack of coverage that's gotten us to that point.
I'm intrigued by something you said a minute ago, and educate me. Maybe maybe everybody knows this, but you mentioned crosscut. So, I mean, I think we want to talk about radio too as an alternative, where maybe the economics are better than traditional newspapers. But what is that? Is that a original content, and are there subscribers, or what?
It's an original content website, and it works out of Seattle. You can subscribe, and you can also donate to it. And there's some folks that have stepped up to fund it. But it has been in operation for 12 to 15 years now. The years pass by fairly quickly the older I get, but and it does a pretty good job of doing all of it. Skip, oh, for gosh sakes, I'm sorry, I can't. Anyway, there have been a group of people there that have been central to all of that. There are a number of news websites in Seattle that have come and gone, but Crosscut has managed to stick.
You know, that's something Ted's going to talk a little bit about, but it's and that goes back to your idea, Ted, of maybe there's things we can't yet imagine that are going to evolve that will provide the sort of local coverage we want. But you know, these are different models for you know, like your nonprofit ones that you've been talking about as replacements for.
Sean Flaherty's on this call somewhere. I don't see his picture, but I actually work for him. He's the publisher of the Wenatchee World right now. He's not in our cohort. He's behind us, but he might have quite a bit to add to that at the
Really?
as well. So he's a weekly or a daily newspaper publisher who sees this every day, and I feel kind of like an imposter talking about it in front of him. But
maybe this is a good opportunity to move into our second theme in terms of what the situation is now, the various elements that are informing developments going forward. Ted, I know you'll take the lead on this, but before we do that, Nancy, could you put up our first poll?
Sure.
Yeah,
Do you
so
see
you
it?
can, yeah, this is up on my screen now. It should be on everybody's screen. Fill this out at your leisure as we're going on, and we'll take a look at it once the three presentations are through. Ted, would you like to take us on a run through on what you see are sort of the key elements of our current situation with local news?
Sure. And I'd also first like to just echo Paul. You know, I'm really honored to be here today and to be talking to so many people from the Whitman community, a lot of very distinguished journalists. I can tell from some of the brief descriptions or conversations we had before we got started. And thank you to Nancy and David and everyone who's organized these different reunions. Could I also just share a few of my own experiences, because I thought maybe it would sort of help reflect what I talk about later. When I attended Whitman, my family lived in Wyoming, and right after I graduated, I went back to Wyoming and I freelanced for the Casper Star Tribune while I was in graduate school there. And you know, after a period of time, the Star Tribune, you know, was encouraging me to apply for a full-time job, but I decided instead to go to Alabama, where I had been an intern at a newspaper, a very good small newspaper there called the Anniston Star. And I just felt that the reporters and the editors there would push me harder and make me a much better reporter than I probably would have gotten in Wyoming. Whether it's true or not, who knows? But anyway, we covered, you know, 5 counties in Northeast Alabama. You know, it's the sort of the southernmost part of Appalachia. And my beat included city and county government and a historically Black college, the State Institute for Deaf and Blind, a federal prison, and a NASCAR super speedway. And, you know, I reported on all kinds of topics from obviously crime and city government, but also crowded jails, the closing of a cotton mill, the last picture show at a big movie theater, and you know, historic preservation, just lots of different stories. And it was always a lot of fun. There are many times when I'd be the only reporter at one of these public meetings. So I'd go to the water board hearing, and the board would be discussing whether to raise the rates, the water rates. And the fact that I was there made a difference in whether people knew what was going to happen to their wallet. And then it was a very important, I felt very important in doing that. And it sort of elevated the conversation in the room when they saw me or my colleagues arrive to go to those things. And then the other thing I'd just like to say is, Whitman was great at teaching me how to ask questions, but I was a very green reporter when I showed up in Alabama. And I was very fortunate to have editors and colleagues who, would teach me, were very patient with me, would argue with me, would, demand that I know the source of the content that I was serving up to the public. So when I read about current trends in journalism, and by the way, I haven't really been in daily journalism now for a number of years, but I've maintained a very strong interest in it. And one of the things that jumps out at me is that the opportunity to be part of a journalism team, like the one I experienced in Anniston and later on when I moved to Albuquerque and to the Associated Press, is just not as common these days. And why is that? It's because as the ownership patterns of newspapers have changed, as technology has come in and changed the dynamic of newsrooms, newsrooms have gotten a lot smaller. And so, I think it's a real problem for people like myself to find mentors and really, develop those skills so that they can be really strong newspaper or radio, TV, or now internet reporters. So, among the reasons for this, when I was really involved in newspapers back in the 70s and 80s, the big concern was chain ownership. That I worked for a newspaper that proudly announced on its front page that it's the largest home-owned newspaper in Alabama. And, that was a point of pride. And, a lot of other newspapers were owned by chains, and that was always seen as sort of the big bad influence. But today, it seems benign, because you have, these hedge funds like Alden Capital have come in to towns. I mean, they've bought, I think they are the second largest newspaper owner in the country by circulation. And, they own some of the big ones, from the Chicago Tribune, the Denver Post, the Orange County Register, as well as one just up the road from me in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, which is down to one reporter. And, this guy, I give him all the credit in the world. He's still out there trying to cover Pottstown, Pennsylvania and the area. But I don't know, how one can really manage if you're the only reporter in a town that size. So, I mean, those are sort of the key things that I was thinking about. But I'd be happy if there was something else that Roland or Paul wanted to add to that.
I was intrigued when we talked the other day, Ted, about the idea of, and that's why I was interested in this crosscut example of different business models for, because just to go back, I mean, it seems like I was interested by this Poynter Institute thing that nobody's really complaining. I mean, people seem to want local news, and it doesn't seem to be a politically charged sort of issue at the local level, at least not yet. But are there different business models or formats that that might make more sense economically, or and you had talked about like kind of some nonprofit models that
Well,
have been tried out.
that's for the bright spot part of the conversation, which is, it's, I mean, it's, when you mentioned Pointer, I mean, that's kind of where the idea started in a lot of ways. The publisher of the St. Petersburg Times was, I think his name was Henry Pointer, and when he died in 1978 or thereabouts, he had formed the Pointer Institute, and he donated the majority of his stock to the company and to the institute. And so the St. Pete Times was owned by the Pointer Institute, and it was run as a nonprofit. And it later became the Tampa Bay Times. The idea has been imitated in a number of other cities. And, that includes the Anniston Star, where I used to work. And it also includes the Philadelphia Inquirer, which is now, I think, the largest newspaper in the country that's being operated as a nonprofit. It's not a panacea for all the problems. What it does, though, is it removes a lot of the pressure to make a profit that is implicit in trying to run a for-profit newspaper. And it does allow for, a real constructive relationship with the community in certain ways that are maybe less feasible in a for-profit only kind of setup. And, another, besides the ownership of the actual news organizations, and in response to the broadcaster model, I think that also cuts across that way as well, because certainly it's true with National Public Radio, but on smaller scales as well. There are a number of organizations that have been established to try to encourage coverage of underrepresented communities or groups in the country. And like Resolve Philly is an organization I've been very aware of in Philadelphia, which grew out of a project that initially involved 13 different media organizations. And they were focused on people returning to society after being in prison for periods of time, reentry. And now they do a lot of different things on, being broke in Philadelphia. And they have reporters, I think there were over 200 stories written in that one project about the reentry. But there's Report for America, which I think Roland actually has more familiarity with than I do. And what they do is they place people with newspapers, and the news or organizations in the newspaper will pay half the salary, and Report for America will pay the other half, and will help the newspaper raise the money for its half. So, that's, it just means that there are people able to, work in the profession and give communities some coverage that otherwise they'd be missing. And I've also been very encouraged by the success of Indian Country Today, which started out as the Lakota Times on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, and now is based in Arizona. It's a national nonprofit, independent nonprofit organization, and it's just doing, I think, excellent work covering Indigenous peoples and American Indians, Alaska Natives in this country. So those are, to me, those are some bright spots. So
I'm actually working with Indian Country Today is run by a former editor of the Seattle PI, the late great lamented Seattle PI. But there's a reporter from there who has come up to Washington State on a partial Report for America funding, and has been hired by the McClatchy papers in the Northwest, which are Bellingham, Tacoma, Olympia, the Tri-Cities, and Boise. and she's going to cover the Indigenous and Native peoples beat. And I'm helping raise money for that. The newspapers, many of the newspapers, Sean could speak to this a little more, have set up foundations that are a blind, basically, away, but they funnel money into the newsrooms of the newspapers that they're set up to help. And the McClatchy newspapers in the Northwest have foundation. I think they have an overarching foundation and then separate foundations for each paper. And we're trying to seek funding from groups that weren't necessarily advertisers in the past, in the old model, where we'd get to law firms or investment companies or companies that would not really need to advertise to the general public, but that would want to do well by their communities to donate money for local news coverage. And Natasha Brennan is doing some pretty great stuff, but the donors that are very interested in giving to that, and we're trying to spread it out amongst as many as possible, are the tribes, because very little has been done on news coverage of tribes in the Pacific Northwest as a beat. They come up whenever there's some sort of dispute or argument over fishing or water rights or opening up a river or tearing down dams or whatever it is. But there's really not a lot of day-to-day coverage of tribal life. And she's trying to get deeply embedded in the tribes and be able to do that kind of work. And that's all being done with Report for America and money from a foundation that supports the other half of that. That's true also at the Spokesman, which has an Indigenous reporter as well that's being paid for by a grant and a series of grants to a foundation that the Spokesman Review runs now. Rob Curley, their editor, is very aggressive about trying to set up foundational paid for content in his newspaper. And those are bright spots about how all this is happening. News organizations suffer from the same sorts of issues that most things in the American economy do, where we're wringing absolutely every efficiency out of it that we can, and going down to doing more with less in practically everything that we do. And it is a reflection of the fact that Main Street is suffering so much that the business model for newspapers isn't working, and we're having to reimagine ourselves. But you can't make as much money online on the online side as you do from circulation and advertising in the print side. And it's true for radio stations as well. And television stations. Radio and television are having a very difficult time. There are, I believe, only 15 independently owned stations left in Washington State right now. So there may be somebody on this call that could correct me in that, but I think that's the number. Kent Phillips and Tom Cock were behind us in school, and they're two of the best radio minds in the business right now. They both do consulting in Washington State, and I was hoping that they might show up, but they could talk for hours about what's going on in broadcast right now. Particularly Kent Phillips. He does a lot of consulting in the radio and television business, primarily radio though.
I was curious about this when Don raised this, and I almost want to bring him in now as well. But Roland and Ted, when you were in Anniston, was there a local radio station that was a news competitor basically that would cover meetings and things? There actually was where I was, but I thought that was an unusual thing for local news coverage by a radio station.
It's
There-
not unusual.
In Anniston, there was a very good news radio station.
I don't mean all news, but could be. But
Well, it wasn't all news, but
Yeah.
it was a very strong news station. And he and I actually, one of their top reporters and I shared a house for a number of years. And there were more than one time when we had both put out calls to sources, and the source would call and say, "Oh, no, let me just talk to both of you because I'm going to say the same thing." And that was a lot of fun. And it was always very hard to beat him on a story. If he was on the story, it was tough because he could get it on the air a lot faster than we could get it in the paper.
Local radios has suffered. There are a lot of, and television as well, you see repeats of ads. The price of rate, they have to keep up for the 24 hours, most stations, but the cost of television and radio advertising has gone down because you can buy that single ad, but they'll do 5 repeats for you over the day as just an add-on to fill in the time. It's they're struggling as well. They're not as in bad a shape as newspapers are, simply because it's a more modern form of delivery, and the fact that the front page of a newspaper has more news on it, words on it, than are said in any national and local put together news broadcast in a day. You just can't get that much out there, but they do break stories constantly.
The local stations in Washington, they
Yeah.
have, I mean, news organizations.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm kind of curious why Don was interested to make sure we touched base on that. Is can we
Yeah.
bring him in just briefly, or I don't permanently, or I,
Could I just get one thing knocked out of the way here pretty quickly, and that's the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, which is part of the reconciliation bill that's in front of Congress right now. Sean Flaherty, who's on this call, is the publisher in Wenatchee, and his paper was purchased from the Woods family a couple of years ago by Francis Wick of Wick Communications. He's from it lives in Arizona now and has a number of smaller daily newspapers across the West and Midwest. And Francis, a couple of years ago, came up with the idea of trying to do something to have Congress step forward and figure out a way to do something through taxes or direct grants or funding of some kind, and to try to sustain local journalism, not national journalism. And he and I talked about it with a few other people, and we came up with sponsors of that bill, which was in the House, which was just for newspapers. And Ann Kirkpatrick, who's just about to retire in Arizona, and Dan Newhouse, who represents the middle of Washington State, agreed to be co-sponsors, the Democratic and Republican co-sponsors of that bill. But it has metamorphed into what Senator Cantwell has put forward, along with a number of Senate sponsors, which is the Local Journalism Sustainability Act. And it's just a series of tax credits. And it's not a direct grant, so you don't have the problem of governmental interference into the delivery of news where direct money is being put forward. What it does is it gives there's a 5-year credit for having a subscription to a local news publication, and it's up to $250 annually. It covers up to 80% of the costs for the first years and 50% for each subsequent year. And you also can, if you choose not to subscribe, that will give you a $500 credit for a donation to a local nonprofit news organization. And then there's the local news journalist compensation credit, and this is for any news organization that does local news. And you get a 5-year credit of up to $25,000 per journalist in the first year and $15,000 for every subsequent 4 years, but you need to keep them going for that time. And the credit covers 50% of compensation up to $50,000 for the first year and 30% up to $50,000 in subsequent 4. And a journalist needs to work a minimum of 100 hours per quarter to qualify for that. So that's pretty significant in terms of employment credits. And then there's a advertising credit for people. It's up to $5,000 in the first year and $2,500 in subsequent 4 years for advertising in local media. And that's 80% of your cost of advertising, to try to help. And it's also to try to help local businesses. That's sponsored by Kirkpatrick and Newhouse in the House, and it's Cantwell and, oh my gosh, I can't remember who in the Senate. Sean may remember. But anyway, that's something, hopefully, that if the Reconciliation Act passes, that it's in it now and it should stay in it. But that would provide a shot in the arm to local businesses that are in the news business. So I
Roland,
just want to get that off the table.
Can you just summarize the one point that, because we noticed this the other day when we noticed the news on that there's criticism, that, you know, it's another example. I mean, I just want you to clarify for me.
What the criticism of it, and it's been primarily, I guess, from the right, is that it will be a little bit like NPR, that it's a direct subsidy. Although NPR's subsidy from the government has declined rather precipitously, the federal government has declined precipitously since the 1970s and makes up almost no real part of their operating budget anymore. It's almost all from either local, state and local governments or from people who subscribe or donate to those services. It isn't what it was in the early 70s when it was created. But that's the argument, is that if government gets involved, you don't have the objectivity. But in the English speaking world, we're kind of in a minority in that, in broadcast, with the Canadian broadcasting, the British broadcasting, and the Australian and New Zealand broadcasting corporations are all funded by tax dollars and licensing of television signal and all the rest of it. It's a fine line, but since you've got somebody that's trying to watch the government, but it's possible to do that without having government interfere in coverage.
While we're talking about the sustainability and the economics of newspapers, I'm wondering if we could call up the results of our first poll. Nancy is.
Yeah, do you see that?
No.
I don't.
Okay.
There
The
you go.
envelope, please.
Yeah, a college educated crowd.
Interesting. So there's a pretty high number of people who get the print newspaper. I mean, more than half. It's according to this.
Sure.
And that's what we need. So we need more people willing to subscribe to the newspapers.
The mix of, it used to be that about 75%, 70 to 75% of revenue was from advertising and 25% was from circulation, and that has flipped in the last decade or so. Seattle Times, as Eric probably knows, was at 50-50 about the time he retired, and now it's probably 35, 65, something like that. Advertising to circulation, perhaps, in terms of the revenue. And there's no way that online subscriptions are going to carry that. And so there has to be some other leg for that stool to stand on.
Yeah. Why don't we throw up the second poll, if we could, at this point, and then we'll move on to our third theme.
I think I've shot the bolt on the third theme.
I wouldn't mind getting other people involved in this discussion too. And we've got such interesting people.
We've hit an hour. And so I think people are going to we're going to have to open it up to questions here pretty quick and discussion.
Yeah. Well, let's
Questions and comments.
Yeah. Let's go quickly through our third theme then, in terms of the implications for the political environment, and then let's throw it open for discussion. Roland, would you like to give us a summary there?
Yeah, the democracy rides on a free press and having an informed electorate and people that understand what's happening in their local governmental entities. In most states, almost all states, most of property tax goes to local governments, and that's the most variable form of taxation, is property taxation. The rest of it is fairly steady. It just increases slightly or greatly over time, but property taxes can go up and down based on levies and bonding of all sorts. And the only way for a local governmental agency to communicate really effectively with their local populace is through their local news organizations to be able to do that. They cannot advocate for those. They are precluded from it by law in every state from advocating for the passage of that, and every territory. And so they rely upon the local news organizations to analyze that, and they're in fear of the local news organizations not backing them and trying to do those bondings for all those local municipal corporations, the library districts, the sewer districts, everybody that's trying to have their hand out to do that, fire districts, all the rest. And the implications for local government and for us governing ourselves and actually paying for ourselves as we go forward are severely impacted by the decline in local news coverage. And
what role does a local press play? Are they, as kind of boosters for those bond
Well,
issues,
they can be boosters for it, but they're also analysts of it. They generally go through it all and they understand the budgets pretty significantly, and they pass judgment on whether they think it's legitimate and fair and right for it to happen. Do we need a new school? Do these pipes really work? If you think about Flint, Michigan, and the water systems across the Midwest, they're all getting pretty old, and there's a lot of advocacy going on in newspapers in those regions to upgrade those water systems and all of that infrastructure. We're in a tough spot in terms of not upgrading our infrastructure. Passing that infrastructure bill was a big deal, and national and local media advocated for it strongly. It's fixing problems all over the country that needed to be fixed when we were graduating from college, and are finally getting around to it. It doesn't work well without it. It just doesn't. You can't run a democracy without a vibrant press. It doesn't happen. David?
Yeah, okay, well, I think we'll open it up now for questions. There's two ways to pose a question. Does everybody know how the hand raise function works? If you don't, message me on chat and I'll read your question for you. I think Roland and Paul, you had mentioned there were a couple folks with us today that might have something to add to the issues that you were discussing. I don't recall the names, but could you refresh our memory?
I'd love to hear from the fellow at the Wenatchee World. I don't know, but I don't know his name, but you did, Roland.
It's Sean Flaherty. Sean, could you pop on?
Yeah, thanks. This is really good. It's good to hear other people.
Turn your camera on, Sean.
Just a sec.
I work for Sean.
Yeah, it's good to see everybody and good to hear people's perspectives on this. Sometimes when you're embroiled in things every day and working on budgets for next year, you forget about some of the things, but you don't forget about how important it is what we're doing. I think ultimately, I've heard some things about radio and broadcast, and I think all media is so fractured that everybody is having challenges that they didn't used to have when they got used to really great profits and business models. And one of the things that you find is that everybody on the internet. I was even on something about there was a local media association webinar today about podcasting and audio streaming, and of course they couldn't answer the question for me. We do some podcasting ourselves. It's like, well, if everybody wants local content, that's very granular. That's people feet on the street reporters, but the internet only makes money on grand scale. And that is ultimately the problem in the last 20 years, not just with news media, but with all media. You're seeing it now even with streaming services displacing cable and such. And we've looked at a lot of different models. We have our feet in a lot of different models. There is some grant funding. Roland mentioned what he's working on, and I think the funding of news reporters is important, but I have an editor who's also, you get worried, just like you would with advertisers, of what are the expectations. And we've had conversations with that, even with what you would think would be good advocacy types of groups for Indigenous peoples, Latinx, things like that, where they want to really steer that. And I would probably defer from my perspective to places like the Spokesman Review and the Seattle Times that are bigger than us, a little bit further ahead of us in setting up those kinds of relationships. But I would say still where there are daily or quasi-daily papers, our reporters are the most our reporters, editors, and photographers are the largest news resource in those communities. I worked with Skip Berger back at the Seattle Weekly. Crosscut's been around pretty much since that was sold. They're a great organization, but much like NPR or Northwest Public Broadcasting, I know some people there too, they really want that narrative and want to go deep, but they're not sitting on every city council meeting, the tax boards, and honestly, neither are we anymore. And we've been able to invest. I guess the good news I'd leave you with, and then I'll be open to questions, is that COVID was good to us. And that's a terrible thing to sort of come out and say. We are challenged But from a subscriber standpoint, while the advertising fell off, we had a lot of people that were concerned about their livelihood and the things that were directly affecting them. And they went straight to a trusted source. So our digital subscriptions grew quite a bit. But again, digital isn't the same as print, whether it's news or advertising. And we just have to be really smart and efficient with our resources as we go forward.
Sean, what is your paid print circulation and online?
Well, so paid print circulation right now, you get a print and a digital subscription with both. On the weekends, we're probably in that 11 to 12,000 range right now. And midweek, which for us now, we're publishing Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday, a weekend edition. So we're no longer 7 or even 6 or 5 days a week. We're 4 days a week in print. And online, you know, you could call us 24/7. We have a reporter staffed all weekend long, but most of it is coming out in the middle of the week based on the news cycle.
Do you sell an email or online only subscription as well?
Yeah, we do. And actually, we've had great success with that in the last 1.5 to 2 years. We were having success before. Rufus Woods, who owned the paper before, used to have a hard paywall. I know people out there are probably frustrated with that, where you wouldn't get any news without subscribing.
Oh, yeah, right.
But the ecosystem is very complex these days. We're very digitally driven, as are most newspapers, especially those larger than us. And so we look at social media. Our email newsletters typically are free ways that we get the news out to people. And then we're constantly nudging them along through our sales funnel to try and get them to pay for the digital journalism.
And just one other quick thing, I'm just so curious. So is this what Roland was saying? Does your income from revenue from subscriptions outweigh greater than either?
So within our organization, we're very close to what I think Roland mentioned, maybe the Times was 8 or 10 years ago. I think we're much closer right now to 50-50. But we're not, you know, the size of our community, as adjacent as it is to Seattle, and with as many people moving over to Chelan County to take up residence here that are wired and smart about how they want to use the internet and get their news. Big cities were disrupted much quicker than, you know, and big dailies, you cannot run a classified section across 200,000 or 300,000 papers and charge someone $25 to list their, you know, their bike for sale. Craigslist
Right.
can only blow that up. There's just no economies in that anymore. So the Seattle Times has very different issues than we do.
Yeah, I think I see Eric, you've had your hand up for quite a while. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Eric Prine, class of 72. My first newspaper job was in the summer of 1970 at the Union Bulletin when Donald Sherwood still owned it.
Oh,
$100 a week. I took home 80 and I saved money that summer. We still wrote we wrote our stories on manual typewriters. So it's, I wanted to, briefly, just as an example of the decline of daily newspapers staffs, I spent about a year as the political editor at the Seattle Times. My staff included 2 reporters in Washington, D.C. and 3 in Olympia. Today, there's nobody in D.C. and there's 1 in Olympia. I did want to mention another new source of revenue that the Seattle Times has kind of pioneered over the years, and that's seeking funding from foundations and corporations and philanthropists to basically fund reporters for certain areas of coverage. In the case of the Times, transportation, education, homelessness. There's an investigative journalism fund that people can contribute to, and I think, boy, they probably those partnerships now probably fund 15, 20, 25 journalists, which is a significant chunk in the greatly decimated news staff. There's always been concern about those sorts of partnerships, the funders wanting to dictate coverage, but the Times executives and news leaders have written some pretty tight contracts and told the funders what to expect. And the first of these partnerships was established 7 or 8 years ago. And so far, I have seen no evidence of any kowtowing to the funders in the nature of the coverage. Maybe the rest of you have had some similar experiences or different experiences with this kind of thing.
I think the important thing is that it's disclosed.
Mhm. With every story that comes out of
Yes.
those teams,
Yeah,
there's a
I
tag.
mean, you hear that on NPR fairly regularly, you know.
Yeah.
I think we can throw up the second poll at this point.
I think Nancy may have stepped away.
She's-
No, I'm here.
There she is.
I'm working on it. Okay, here we go. You see that?
Are you
Okay.
going to do instant results, or are you going to wait for a minute?
That poll reminds me of those ones you used to get that said, how did you find out about us? And about 10 years ago, newspapers fell off of that when you'd go shop at a store or go to the dentist or something. Broke my heart.
So I've closed the poll.
Well, it's interesting. I'd be curious what the other is.
Over the back fence.
Well, there is some of that. That's true. You know, what you hear at church or at the grocery store.
Yeah, Jack and Donna Rice, I see your hands raised.
You're muted. Can you unmute?
Unmute.
There you
There
are.
we go.
Yeah,
Oh, thanks.
we're old grads too, from 1967.
In 1966.
There you go. And
I'm pretty naive about all this, but I think it would be somewhat helpful to me if the conversation that you're having now, if newspapers would, on the editorial page or something, educate us or continue to educate us about why newspapers and reporting is so important, and teach us about the funding of newspapers. So for instance, Don and I get the paper Olympian delivered.
and the
well,
Seattle Times.
Well, we get it primarily because we like to hold the paper in our hands. But, I think if people understood that was more, I didn't realize how important that source of income was. Well, I don't know anything about the business of newspapers. So anyway, that's just the thought I had.
It's a valid point. One of the things that I think is also important to mention is that we've talked about foundations and supporting either newspapers or radio and TV stations or specific types of coverage. But foundation support isn't permanent for the most part. You may get a grant that lasts for a few years, but then after that, you have to have come up with some other way of supporting whatever it is you're undertaking. So, I think it's really important that all of us, subscribe to our local newspapers and, support good quality journalism. And then, to really do everything we can to make sure that these institutions do continue for the next the generations to come.
Eric?
Yeah, just in response to the Rice's comment, the Seattle Times has in fact, just within the past year, created a position on the editorial page to do just what they're talking about. It's actually another former Whitty, Briar Dudley, who I think graduated in the late 80s. He's now their free press editor, and he writes newsletters and weekly columns. Doing this kind of thing and advocating for things like the legislation that Roland talked about. And one final comment about I'm pleased to see the strong support for newspapers in these polls, but this is a generally older crowd, and I'm reminded of the display ads I see in the Seattle Times now that really seem to be dominated by Medicare plans and retirement communities.
I think Dale Harrell has raised her hand several times.
Thank you very much. And I have a very, a very low, excuse me, local question. I'm in, and right outside of Norfolk, Virginia. The Virginian Pilot was a very, very popular newspaper for the entire state. It's really declined. I don't even know why we continue to subscribe to it, except, it has the obituaries and the house sales. I mean, that sort of takes over the whole topic. But last August, there was suddenly an article on the front page about Whitman College. And someone called me and said, didn't you go to Whitman, which was unique unto itself. The story was that there was a rioting going on Whitman College because they wanted to take down a statue, I didn't even know where it was, of Neiman Marcus, and there'd been, a lot of mishandling for the Indian tribes and so on. And it had specifically mentioned my grandfather, about which I knew nothing of this. Well, I think I may have called Nancy, or I just called the college because I said, is there rioting going on at Whitman? What kind of a unique situation that would be, and what is happening? And they said, well, not much is happening. Where are you getting your news? And I said, from the Virginian Pilot, the front page. Well, that, fine, take that as an answer and forget it. Well, about 3 weeks ago, or maybe longer, 4, a friend of mine from one of my Whitman graduate friends sent me an article from the Seattle paper with the same article, same subject, on about rioting or unhappiness and so on at Whitman College about Neiman Marcus, and my grandfather and others had raised money for this college that was on improper land, and so I called. I have a great nephew who's there on the campus. And I said, so is there a riot? Is there a big controversy? And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. So I guess my question is, where does newspaper articles, why would that newspaper article be deposited in Norfolk, Virginia paper? And yet, where did they get that information, and why would they think it would be of interest on the East Coast? When it really, and then find out a couple of months later, it was in the Seattle paper, but there doesn't seem to be any particular problem on the campus. I'm just, it made me very very distrusting of news. I mean, you are anyway, but I mean, that really corked it, because that was Whitman, which nobody knows anything about in my area anyway. So where would they get that information, and why would a newspaper feel obligated? Were they desperate for news?
Did the article have any attribution? Did it say it was from, a syndicate? Or
no, it didn't. It didn't say.
Yeah.
It didn't say. It just was, there. And I wrote a letter to the newspaper, knowing full well it wouldn't matter.
Yeah.
But just because I was personally involved in Whitman getting into the local news, and then that sort of died down, but then it came back out again in Seattle, a month ago or thereabouts. I'm just curious because I know nothing about how news operates. It was just a strange thing.
Sounds very strange.
I mean, the first question is who wrote the story? It seems like it would have said that on the article itself, but
Yeah.
that would get to the beginning of kind of, I take point with your consternation, and
It was unique that Whitman made the news in Norfolk, Virginia.
that's for sure.
Yeah, okay,
Well,
let's
the only,
see.
Dale, the only source I can find for that is actually on the
I see.
renamed Pioneer, the Whitman Wire. And it's the only news source that speaks of any kind of unrest on campus at all. It was written by a student in last April.
Uh-huh, okay.
That's the only source that comes off of a news search. Anyway, I can look.
Well,
That's-
I mean, I was just startled.
Yeah, well, I'm startled by the story as well. I was pretty intimately involved with both trying to retain the Marcus Whitman statue in the legislature, and then the push by the tribal interests to put Billy Frank in Marcus Whitman's place in this last legislative session. I was involved with both of those things. And it was pretty smoothly done, actually, and not acrimoniously done the second time. The first time it was a little bit like a retention election for a judge, but anyway.
Well, I just remember my grandfather, Stephen Penrose, very proud of getting we would go out during rush week or, the first week of school, we would go out to see the Marcus Whitman monument and so on. I mean, it just had a totally different context for me.
I think I see a hand up here. Jan Dappen. We haven't heard from you yet.
Yeah, actually, it's my hand, Andy speaking here. And I guess I was interested from the panelists. Misinformation and disinformation has been such a prevalent problem,
Right.
in the national press right now. And I think the right has done a pretty good job of kind of casting any news organization that vets its information, whether they're conservative or not, as being part of the liberal press. And I'm wondering, from the panelist point of view, with the daily papers and the local news, are you seeing some of the same problem with, I guess, particularly from my point of view, conservative readers being distrusting of the local press because it's gotten castigated as being part of the liberal movement?
I'd like to defer to Andy Dappen's publisher, Sean, who could answer it directly for his local community. Sean, are you still there?
Yeah, distrust in media is at a, or trust, I guess, is at a very low point. I think Pew Research has shown that again and again. And, one of the things that, we pick up, we share a lot of stories in the Pacific Northwest and have access to other daily papers through not just an AP Newswire, but we can pick up things from the Seattle Times, the Tri-City Herald and such. And in central Washington here, especially in Chelan County, we're a pretty even mix of conservative and I don't know about liberal, but definitely a Democratic mindset. And we're getting more that way as people move, if you talk about the county, move into Leavenworth and Chelan. And, I guess just in general, we like the reporting that the Seattle Times does, but sometimes a headline, a photo choice, or even a story choice as we try to explain the things that are going on in the region, particularly Seattle, that drives so much of what's going on in the state and the state house. Those things can, I won't say backfire, but they can further shape people's perception of our paper, even though that's not local reporting. And then more recently, I think we just wrapped up a school election. I think the votes just finally got counted. And, there are things creeping in to school board elections when you talk about critical race theory and things that really aren't on the board even, but those are keywords and buzzwords, and we try to report on them. And I think that it's challenging. And I think it's not as simple as left and right or conservative and Democrat. There are so many different shades, and the internet fuels that because you can go find what you want to find ultimately on the net if you go down some deep rabbit holes. So I think that's a challenge we all face right now if we're going to stay as a legitimate source for people.
Yeah, Jack and Donna, back to you.
I think their hand is left. They just left their hand raised. So Tom
Okay.
Peterson has a question.
Kyra has a question too. She just hasn't been raising her hand mechanically. Turn your mic on, Kyra.
Tom? Oh,
Turn your mic on. There we go.
Can you
Tom's
hear
got
me
his
now?
hand up. Do you want to? Oh,
Can you hear me now?
There, go.
Okay, my question, I wrote it in the chat, is have you commented on the weekly newspapers? That's where I get a lot of my local news.
Oh, well, I represent the weekly newspapers as well and the broadcasters here, and the issues are the same. It's just not as chronic with the weekly newspapers. The advertising circulation mix was about the 50-50 point for them historically, and they've had a fall off, but they haven't seen the fall off that at least the rural weekly newspapers that
Well, I live in Portland and we have the Willamette Week and we get a lot of scuttlebutt and information about local government and so forth. So I just wondered what your comments were about the weeklies.
well, that weekly's far different. It's an urban weekly, and it's very much a city weekly, and some of those have really suffered. The Seattle Weekly went out of business because they were living primarily on entertainment news, and it really broke down entertainment advertising, and people are not sourcing. We're not sourcing the weekly for entertainment advertising, and they were in a kind of a struggle with the stranger. The Willamette Week is actually taking on, or whatever it's called now, has been taking on the Oregonian head-to-head for political news coverage, but it suffers from the advertising decline just the same. The rural news weeklies don't really suffer from that quite so much, for reasons that Sean could tell you better than I.
Okay.
How about, is it Tom now?
Yeah, I think Tom's next up.
Sorry, Tom.
Great. Thank you. Good evening. Yeah, I'm Tom Peterson. I'm here in the Dalles, Oregon. My father attended Whitman, and I also have a brother and sister who both went to Whitman, and they informed me of this meeting, and that's why I'm here tonight. I run a CCC News digital news operation here in the Dalles. I've been doing it for about 18 months, and I'm hearing something very exciting coming from Roland in regards to these tax breaks tax credits in regards to advertisers. And Roland, can you tell me what the timeline looks like on that? And do you think this thing can come through unscathed? I am having a fair amount of success in my operation. I'm able to sell advertising, but boy, if I could offer, an 80%, tax credit to my advertisers, I could put probably 5 people on the streets. It would be an amazing turnabout.
So, Tom, what you need to do is contact Senator Wyden's office.
Yep.
I can't remember who the name of the person is that he has as a lead, but he's one of the top 4 sponsors of that effort. And so if you reached out to his office and asked for the person that's handling that for him, they could talk to you about what implementation would look like in Oregon. It's going to be across the country. I'm not that familiar with what implementation is going to look like what the start date would be, but it would have to be for the next fiscal year and not this fiscal year.
Okay.
But they would be able to tell you a lot more about that and in some detail. And if you have a problem with that, you can contact Senator Cantwell's office as well in Washington State, since you're on the border. They would talk to you as well about all of that. But ask for the person the policy person that's handling the Local Journalism Sustainability Act is what you're asking for. Is that fair enough?
That's fantastic, Roland. Yeah, I'll give them a shout tomorrow. But
And Tom, could you just describe briefly what your organization is? I'm intrigued by these alternate,
Sure.
vehicles for.
Absolutely. About 20 months ago, I was working for the Dallas Chronicle, and I got a phone call saying that they were going to lock the doors 3 days later. And
Wow.
found myself in a position, a great position actually, of being able to go out and work for myself. Because as you all believe, I do too, that if you tell a story well, there's a great audience for it out there. That's never going away. This is a craft that is definitely part of us, our nature as humans. And so as I was looking that over, I was able to hook up with a technology kind of a guru, if you will, but my business partner eventually. And we developed a website, and we are reaching 60,000 page views now already. We've got 35,000 local viewers, and we can publish daily. And we are primarily supported through advertising, but we also have a donation subscriber situation, so people don't have to donate. I think that's just so necessary in this day and age, to be sending our messages out to folks who don't normally pay for a paper. We're trying to lift all boats, if you will, and educate people. I think that's the number one. We've gone to a bilingual format so people can get their pages translated. So we're putting it all together, and it's working. I have a lot of hope. I just, the newspaper, I'm just like everybody else. I love sitting down on a Sunday morning and pulling out my paper and getting my fingers black and reading it, because it's so relaxing. There's nothing popping out at you or any of that kind of stuff. It's really a therapy, if you will, for me. But I realized that that couldn't go on anymore, and so I had to find a new way. Maybe we'll get to a great computer screen someday that's easier on the eyes. But that's just that's where
And,
we're at, and we're
and Tom, do you have a reporting staff?
I have myself, Cole Goodwin, and then we rely on a lot of stringers. So I pay people up to $100 per story. I pay for photos, and I'm trying to build a staff. Generally speaking, I want to hire folks, but I got to get to that next plateau. But I think we're headed there. It's just a matter of time.
Interesting. Interesting.
I see Wendy Sanger with her hand up.
Give me a call. I need to talk to you about using ICs so that you don't get burned by the Labor Department. I'm serious. Call me. We'll talk about it. If you live in Washington, they'd be exempt by definition, but you're not in Oregon, so we need to talk about using stringers in Oregon.
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds good. Yep.
Okay, let's move over to Wendy. Let's give Wendy the floor.
Okay, my quick question for Paul, since he also wrote for a publication in India. My business is in India, and I've seen and I've been working there and going there for the last 20 years, and I've seen them kind of trend the same direction we're trending, with respect to distrust of media and the democratic process, which I think go hand in hand. And so the thread that I'm following here is, if I'm listening correctly, is that less reporting, less attendance at government meetings translates to and then it relates in ways to a distrust of the media, along with other issues that lead to distrust of the media, which then leads to distrust of the government, which then leads to a fracturing or even, to use strong language, a threat to the democratic process. And so my question is, how do we turn it around? Because it seems like that it might start with this problem that we've identified with local news, or the dearth of local news reporting. So maybe that's the place where we turn it around. and start fixing this, because people seem to follow their own interest. And in our local paper, I know our very local paper, not the San Diego Union, but the Coronado Eagle Journal, they always sandwiched the local stories with the photographs of your kid and the Rotary, prize and all the, as many photographs as possible of the people, figuring, I don't know, whatever that adage is about, show the Girl Scouts, show the, show all that fun stuff. But then they managed to put the important stories in too. So, so do you feel like, if we follow all these wonderful ideas that you've discussed for the wave of the future, the wave of the future, that we can turn around this trend, that I really feel is a threat to democracy, not just here, but also in the world's largest democracy, which is India. What do you think, Paul?
Your knowledge about India actually is probably better than mine, because our audience is mostly their company clients that are based in the US or in Western Europe. But I mean, I was just intrigued by that Poynter Institute finding, and Sean is kind of, I mean, maybe it was oversimplified, or I was reading oversimplification into it, but that one place where people still do have kind of a traditional sense of trust, not blind trust, but trust in the media, was at the local news level. And I found that encouraging to find almost kind of, what am I trying to say? Not like safe house, but neutral ground in the media wars that you might build from, or at least would have a place where that there wasn't the sort of cultural animosity or divisions between, different political persuasions. And so that was interesting to me, was to see that, maybe, I don't know if you can grow from that, but at least that there's a place where maybe people do feel better about because the whole plus of traditional media, and this becomes part of the, the political question, is, whether it reflects the bias of the reporters and the editors, but the whole idea of gatekeepers, I think Ted used the word synthesis, or maybe it was Roland, but gatekeepers isn't to keep people out, but it's to have people who are knowledgeable about a subject helping to make sense of it for people. And that seems to me to be, it's always going to have some sort of political overtones just by selection of stories, but you take what you can get, and to have people who are, and starting at the local level, who are trying to make sense of what's going on, who will sit through the 4-hour water board meeting and pluck out what is, what people need to know from that, instead of forcing them to watch a 4-hour YouTube. So I just thought that was kind of an encouraging note, that if that finding is valid, that local news may be a place where people still have some trust, and justifiable trust, in traditional media.
Well, and maybe it's up to individual citizens, Paul, to use whatever forum we have, even if it's we go to the city council meetings, and then we write a letter to the editor. If they don't have reporters, maybe it's up to us. We don't have backgrounds as journalists, but we can still be gadflies, and we can ask our own questions and do our own reporting, if we have the vehicle. And it'd be real nice if it was something besides social media, where nobody's ever won an argument or made a point without unleashing the Kraken. So
yeah, interesting observations.
Any final comments from our panelists before we sign off for the evening?
I like to, I'll reiterate something, or not reiterate, but point to something Ted said, which I hadn't heard him mention when we've been talking over the last couple of days, but that, you don't want to give up hope. There may be models that we can't yet envision. We've heard about some versions of that might work, but that that people's desire for, roughly objective, or at least attempted at objective news is going to trump other sorts of barriers that make that difficult. And I mean, you can call that Pollyannish, but you could also say that, you've got to have a little bit of hope in you. That I was quite encouraged by, Ted, your comments about that early on when you were saying that.
Well, thank you. I mean, I do think some of the models that are out, like, I'm very impressed by the New York Times and what they do when I spend time on their website or I read their newspaper, because you can go at the highest level. You can just basically read the headlines and the first couple paragraphs of a story, but you can also go very deep on a subject. And they have some videos. They do amazing things with the photography and with the data. And I mean, I'd say the New York Times, because that's what I read on a fairly regular basis, but I've certainly seen it in other news outlets as well. I mean, how that gets translated to the local level, I think is what's going to be really challenging. But I think it'll be really interesting. And, somebody alluded to the fact that newspapers used to make a lot of money. I mean, I remember seeing a headline when I was doing some research for this from 1994 about, why newspapers make so much money. Their profit margins were 25–30% at a time when most Fortune 500 companies were happy to get roughly 5%. And that money wasn't necessarily invested well. It wasn't really invested back in the newsroom. A lot of it went to the shareholders, a lot of it went to the owners. And the leadership of those news organizations was not nimble enough, was not innovative enough to capture the opportunities that existed when the internet came along. There are people out there who I believe will be able to do that in the years to come. It's probably not in 2022, but it could be within the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, I've seen so much change in other ways that have made life actually easier and better through technology. So that's my hope.
So everybody on this call everyone we know doesn't need more stuff. We are a very rich country. Give subscriptions as gifts. Sign people up for newsletters. Buy local newspaper subscriptions for your friends. You might change the world.
There you go.
Can I ask Ted a quick question?
Sure.
Because we're talking about the future, and you're actually your wife has the foundation, or has the organization that's she's there. Are you looking at her? Tell her hi.
She's right off camera. Yes.
All right. Yeah. So you're teaching the next generation journalism, health writing about health news. But can you talk about that a little bit? What do they think? Are you getting them? Are their pieces being placed? Are they locally in local journals, or where are their pieces being? I mean, I know they're young, but can you just kind of share the next generation that's coming up and thoughts about that?
Do you want to try? Okay, I've been given permission to discuss this. So Healthy News Works, works with elementary and middle school kids, ages 5 to 13. And what they learn, is very basic. I mean, it's things like, what is a fact? And Marion was telling me today that there are kids who've never actually seen a newspaper. So to some degree, it's what is a newspaper? But they learn a lot about, where to get reliable information, how to ask critical questions. They learn about how to present themselves professionally. And they go out and they interview experts, which could be the school principal or the school nurse, or it could be the Surgeon General of the United States, or Kathleen Sebelius, the former Secretary of Health. So they interview these people and they produce newspapers for their school that, are pretty simple. I mean, they're like on paper like this. But the kids really care about it. It's fact-based information, focusing on health topics. And once a year, they produce a book, and they also do videos and that kind of thing. The circulation is primarily within the schools, and then also on the website. And I don't know, at least I think I covered the main points. But.
So there's a hope of the future, ...
Well, so this has been around now for 18 years, and there are actually some kids who were in the program who are now working in some type of communications role, at newspapers and stuff. Yeah, and the other thing that my alter ego here is saying is there's a huge component, and this is something we probably should have talked about a little bit earlier, is the whole idea of media literacy, understanding how to read a newspaper, and what it means when you see something in a newspaper or in print, on a website. So, and tied in with it for Healthy Newsworks is the whole idea of health literacy, because a lot of people really have no idea how to understand basic things about health. So.
If there aren't additional comments, I'd like to thank everybody who participated today. Like Paul, I'm just really happy at how many people decided to join us this evening, both our classmates as well as people from other classes and even outside the Whitman community. So thank you all for participating. Thank you for contributing. And if you're interested in doing something like that again, message me via the alumni office. Be happy to work with you. And finally, a big thanks to Nancy and Jennifer of the alumni office. Through this process for the past 7 weeks, we couldn't have done any of this without your support. Thank you so much.